We're going to talk about planes of motion. So planes of motion are descriptive terms to describe how someone's moving. We also use it to describe how to perform an exercise and how we move in that exercise. So we have three planes of motion. Our first plane is a sagittal plane. So Chris, I'd like you to just move in the sagittal plane for me. So you can just walk forward. Exercises that we use in this plane of motion, step back. Go into a lunge if you could please. So a lunge is a sagittal plane motion. And come back. Let's do a bicep curl. Because the elbow is fixed here, this is also in sagittal plane. So really anything where we're moving across and forward here where we're fixed. What about a front raise with the shoulders? Okay, that's also sagittal plane. Running, cycling, most swimming is going to be sagittal plane or sagittal plane dominant. What you'll see is a lot of sports, particularly actually multi-plane movements. But running, for example, is predominantly sagittal plane, along with transverse, which we'll look at in a second. This plane of motion is also known as median plane, but predominantly you'll know it as sagittal plane. Okay, let's look at the frontal plane, please. So Chris is now stepping in the frontal plane. If you think about sports where you use this a lot, tennis players across the baseline. So you see the step there. You also see that it's more than one thing. So Chris was actually going into a combination of planes of motion, but we also had a lot of transverse plane there, which is our next plane. So Chris, this time we're going to a rotation movement. So imagine exercises you might use in the gym, things like wood choppers. Excellent. Sports, imagine hitting things like, well, most sports really. Racket sports, huge amount of transverse plane. So could be cricket, but really any sport has components of all three. Some sports are hugely more one than the other. That was a great example. We just kind of demonstrated a golf swing where it's actually predominantly in the transverse plane, so rotational movements. The key about using planes of motion is a couple of different things. One is that we now use exercises or exercise names using these planes of motion to help describe. As we now have literally thousands of exercises, you need to be able to just read a name and interpret that language into, well, how do I perform this? So you'll use it on a day-to-day basis in terms of using exercise in the sagittal plane, the frontal plane, or in the transverse plane. But also, if you're going to work with anyone in terms of sports performance, and that might just be a weekend warrior, a footballer, it might be a golfer. You need to understand the requirements of their sport and make sure that your training matches the requirements they have. It's no good training a person in a sagittal plane motion when their sport's predominantly a transverse plane sport. So the key is to understand how you look at movements and analyse it. You might not be able to train all those in one movement in the gym, but you might break down the requirements into different movements that then build up to more replicate the actual movement that the client then performs in a sports environment. So let's quickly look at those again. So we go forward, sagittal, backward, still sagittal, come laterally, now frontal, and then we have our transverse plane, our rotation. So those are planes of motion.